Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Michelle Asai and I'm the managing editor of Iranian Cinema and Women Poets Compendia at the Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. I welcome you all to another inspiring session of our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali seminar series, Iranian Women Poets, which is co-convened by Professors Muhammad Tawakkoli Targhi, Rivan Sandler, and Azita Taleghani. At the outset, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and prosper on their ancestral homeland. Now, I would like to welcome our guest speaker today, Professor Ahoo Najafian of Macalester College to the University of Toronto, albeit online and virtually. My colleague, Professor Azita Taleghani, will be introducing Professor Najafian and will moderate today's session on feminine voice in classical Persian poetry, invisible, impossible, or immaterial. Professor Taleghani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Asai. Welcome everybody to our weekly Elahé Omidyar Mir-Djalali webinar series on women poets. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Ahoo Najafian today. Professor Najafian is Assistant Professor of Religion at Macalester College when she teaches on Islam, gender, arts, and literature. Her research focuses on the intersection of religion, literature, and politics in Iran and intellectual history of the related concepts. She's working on a manuscript titled Poetic Nation, Iranian Soul and Historical Continuity on the meaning, production, and consumption of Irfan, mysticism in 20th century Iran through the figure of Hafiz, the 14th century poet. She holds a PhD in religious study from Stanford University, a master's degree in gender studies from the University of British Columbia, master and bachelor degree in English literature from the University of Tehran. As Dr. Asai mentioned, the title of Professor Najafian's lectures today is on feminine voice in classical Persian poetry, invisible, impossible, or immaterial. Professor Najafian.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for being here. I should say it's a bit daunting to speak among some of the scholars that I recognize here. So I look forward to hearing your feedback. I'm going to share my screen. I have some poems that I'd like to share with you. And just a note before going into the talk, I'll be using some crude, lewd, obscene language in this talk. Sorry, Mahsati and Obaid are involved and there's no escaping from that type of language. And that might be the essence of feminine language, maybe, we don't know. And again, as you were saying the title of my talk, so wow, that's why am I not giving any positive thing in the talk? Invisible, impossible, immaterial. So that's one of the things perhaps we could talk more about in the Q&A. With that, I'm going to share my screen with you. Feminine voice in classical Persian poetry. And again, why I'm interested in finding if we can even talk about it or not. Okay. Male attitudes toward female authorship have not always been sympathetic. One just has to remember that not so long ago, belief in the Western world that women who wrote were considered to be unladylike monsters. Remember Horace Walpole's characterization of Mary Wollstonecraft as that hyena in petticoat? Female authors resembled the mothers of illegitimate and deformed children, in that none produced what they were supposed to. Because when uttered by a woman, words become meaningless, sentences let loose, and the literary messages distorted and destroyed. In the Islamic context, the same can be read from the 14th century satirist Obaid Zalkani, in whose cheer-inducing treatise, Risale Delgosha, declared women's writing, in some other versions, women's voices, are similar to vaginal farts. While his might be amongst the few vile comments, one can find problematic assessments among those who respect women's poetry. For example, Ashaq Chelebi, who praises the eloquence of Mehri Khatun, the 16th century Ottoman poet, finally finds her poetry like menstrual fluid that comes from the male gender. This is saying that writing poetry for women is as unnatural as men's menstruation. If we go beyond the comparisons of women's writings with bodily fluids and gases and look at biographies of women poets compiled by male authors within the Persian sphere, we can still detect a sense of wonder. For example, in his introduction to his Tazkere, which is a collection of biographies, and you'll hear me, all are expert here, I don't need to explain Tazkere to you, on 31 female poets and their poems, Fakhri Hiravi, the 16th century author critic explains the raison d'etre of the anthology as such. Reading a ghazal by Mehri, which he mistook for that of Hafiz, quote, "My heart was so touched and my mind so impressed by the bewildering incident that I decided to compile the poetry of women. And as these rare jewels from their minds were so wondrous, I called this short book Jewels of Wonder, Jawahirul Ajaib." The existing Tazkaras on women poets are written by male authors, often at the request and with the patronage of elite women, but still are characterized by the male imaginary gaze of their context. In other words, similar to their Western counterparts, these critics took the male thought and writing to be the same as thinking and writing in the universal, masking the truth with which phallocentrism hides its fiction. Looking at the works of three women poets, namely Mahsati Ganjavi, 12th century, Padshah Khatun, 13th century, and Jahan Malek Khatun, 14th century, and the ways in which they are represented in the Tazkeras, including Tazkere Gozide by Hamdullah Mustafi, Tazkerat al-Shu'ara, Malik Shah Samarkandi, Jawahirul Ajaib Fakhri Hiravi, and Naql Majlis by Mahmud Mirza Qajar. This talk investigates the possibility of recovering the feminine voice in palaces of poetry owned and built by men. And I just want to say something about why I have chosen these three. Mahsati is the most frequently portrayed poet who appears not only in biographies of women poets, but is also included in biographies of male poets as a skilled quatrain writer, Rubai Sara. Padshah Khatun is one of the few ones who consciously plays with her paradoxical position as a woman king in what is remained of her poems. And Jahan Malek offers a rare occasion for a female poet to compile her poems and wrote a preface to her divan. Before looking at these poets, I would like to draw your attention to the convention of Persian poetic canon on the one hand, and idiosyncrasies of Persian as a gender-neutral language on the other, which makes talking about a feminine or masculine voice a bit tricky. Classical Persian poetic genres such as quatrain and ghazal, and genres that are chosen by our poets here, are highly stylized and follow strict conventional forms with limited stock imageries, metaphors, tropes, and persona. Therefore, they do not really reveal any specific detail about the poet's life, and in fact, might even conceal the personality of the poet behind all the literary codes and conventions. And I agree with Lozensky, who states, if we read these poems as personal confessions, almost all poets in the tradition would share the same biography. And again, I'm aware that there are poems written for certain occasions, but again, talking about the general themes that are there. Every poet is a lovelorn lover whose love is not being answered by the cruel beloved. Therefore, in order to be able to find a place in the canon, the poet should very closely imitate the poets that have come before him or her. Intertextuality is one of the central elements of the canon, where each individual poem echoes others and partakes in complex systems of conventions. Therefore, there is no surprise that women poets are imitating their male counterparts. The canon dictates and encourages such imitations. Besides, Persian is a gender-neutral language and does not offer a distinction between masculine and feminine nouns, pronouns, and we should determine the gender through the context. And here again gets problematic because according to our modern norms of beauty, the adjectives that are used for a male beloved, for example, might sound like feminine. For example, long hair, small waist, plump lips. So all are characteristics that we attribute to female beauty. Another issue that makes this tricky situation even trickier is the ambiguous beloved. So another theme of Persian poetry is the beloved for whom the poet lover composes all the songs. The beloved is one of the most ambiguous poetic characters. He can be a real person, an ideal abstract human, male, sometimes female, the patron, a religious figure, and God. Identifying the gender becomes trickier if we bear in mind that love in Persian poetry is characterized by homoeroticism, where a male lover poet pines after a male beloved object of desire. So we might stop and ask, even if we consider the woman poet to be writing in her feminine voice, is she writing for a male or a female beloved? And with these questions in mind, let's take a look at our first poet, Mahsati Ganjavi. Again, with a warning, some crude language will be used. Historiographers do not even agree upon the name of our first poet. Yet not only does she appear in almost all works on women poets, she's one of the few women who appears in general biographies of poets. She has been called Mahsati, Mehsati, or Mahasti, meaning the moon lady, the great lady, or the greatest being, respectively. She might have been called Manija, we don't know. She might have been born in Ganja, in modern-day Azerbaijan, or Neshabur, in modern-day Iran, sometime around 1092, which makes her a contemporary of the other master of Rubai, Omar Khayyam. Now we'll come back to Khayyam. He's a contemporary of the mighty Seljuqi ruler, the patron of the arts, Sultan Sanjar, who had a vast region from Transoxiana to Iraq under his control from 1118 to 1157. And imagine, I started as a math major, sorry. She is famous for her quatrains and introducing the Shahrashub or Shahrangiz genre to Persian poetry. So the genre city thriller, literally creating chaos in the city, chronicles the male beauties of the city as one of the urban attractions. And this is a newer, new if we imagine that she lived 1,000 years ago. I'll tell you why this idea that she introduced Shahrashub is a newer one. In Mahsati's quatrains, these beauties are bazaar shopkeepers and craftsmen, such as the butcher, baker, blacksmith, tailor, hatter, muazzin, and sometimes the judge or the preacher. Because only few of her poems were scattered in different poetry collections, it was assumed for a long time that she was in love with a butcher. as those were the quatrains that kept appearing in different collections. And here are two examples of those shahrashubs for the butcher. The butcher, as is his custom, threw me, slew me, and said to me, "This is what I do." He lays his head cruelly in my lap again, breathing my breath until he flays me. And then the other one, more tongue-in-cheek, that butcher boy was opening his shop, and people had gathered around staring at him. He kept touching his hips while singing, "Bravo to my beautiful plump butt." And this goes the same for the baker and the smith and everyone. In most of these quatrains, she describes the physical beauty of these young men who attract the gaze of both men and women. She sometimes pokes fun at older men, for example, in this quatrain for the judge. When his wife got pregnant, the judge began to cry. Begrudgingly, he asked, "How could this happen? I'm old and my cock doesn't work, and this whore is no Mary. What is this child?" The only constant in Mahsati's biography and poetry is historiographers disputing over the accuracy of certain episodes of her life and her character based on acceptance or rejection of those stories. Her presence at Sultan Sanjar's court is one of the episodes that is repeated by many biographers. And Attar also has a story in Elahé that deals with a love triangle between the king, a slave boy, and Mahsati. And in that story, he refers to Mahsati as Dabir o Chang Nawaz, so secretary, author, and the lute player. So in most of the tazkiras, she does not, a life story does not appear under an independent entry for her. She is mentioned when the subject is a ruler or other poets. In Tazkirat al-Shu'ara, for example, Dawlat Shah Samarkandi mentions her under Aqab Bukhari as his contemporary and a fellow poet in the court of Sultan Sanjar. One evening at court, the Sultan asked about the weather. It was snowing, and Mahsati extemporized following quatrain. "O king, heavens put the saddle on your horse of happiness and chose to praise you among all the kings. So as to guard your gold-shoed horse from mud, the sky covered the earth with silver sheet." The Sultan enjoyed the quatrain so much that Mahsati was invited to join his close circle. The other famous but dubious story about Mahsati is her relationship with another poet, Amir Ahmad ibn Khatib Ganjavi. Fakhri Harawi in Jawahir al-Ajaib describes Mahsati as belonging to a noble family and esteemed and respected member of Sultan Sanjar's eminent court. He's quick to add, what they say about Mahsati and Amir Ahmad is not real, and her riches and fortunes were possible only because of her own merits. The story whose authenticity is being denied is one that has been recorded in one of the most authoritative tazkiras and one of Fakhri Harawi's main sources, Tarikh Gozide by Hamdullah Mustafi. While there's an entry for her in Tarikh, and there it's just one of the quatrains about the butcher boy is mentioned. The story is mentioned under Ahmad's account. According to Mustafi, she is said to have been the mistress, and some editions have it as wife, Mankuhe, of the poet Tajuddin Ahmad ibn Khatib Ganjavi, who was in poetic debate with Mahsati and invited her to sleep with him, and she refused by sending him these lines. "O idol, degrade my body with you I will not, nor even with one far better than you I shall not. In the trap of your tresses I won't fall, in water I'll lie and won't get wet at all." Later on, he somewhat tricked her into sleeping with him and said to her afterwards, "O idol, degrade your body how well you did, and went back on your words most splendidly. You said I lie in water and won't get wet, I made you wet lying on earth. And it is this episode, the truth of which Fakhri Heravi vehemently rejects. And Edward Brown, really, you can feel that he blushes when he's retelling the story and says the ribaldry has gone so far. And his judgment of Mahsati's character is that she seems to have a gay disposition. So I really don't know what he meant by that. So just keep that in mind, that this is a Victorian gentleman judging the poet. So again, we do not know if the two were married or not, Mahsati or Ahmad, but there is another quatrain that gives rise to the story that the two had a relationship. So, and this quatrain has remained in two versions. The first rendition is, I am Mahsati, the possessor of all things good under the skies. I am famed for my beauties from Khorasan to Iraq. O son of Ganja's Khati, don't leave me burning in separation. But many scholars believe that it's a sanitized version of the following. I am Mahsati, the possessor of all things good under the skies. I am famed for my beauty from Khorasan to Iraq. O son of Ganja's preacher, with your doorway like ass, give me bread, meat, and cock, or it's triple divorce for you. If you accept the obscene version as authentic and autobiographical, because as I said, it's very difficult to say that all the poems are autobiographical, we can read a lot of female transgression. It looks like the poet first wants to raise the jealousy of the husband by reminding him how everyone is longing after her. But the second distich raises our suspicions about the husband's preoccupations with other men, as describing the ass as a doorway might be a reference to Khatib's openness to anal intercourse. The final part of the quatrain reverses one of the institutions of Islamic law as the right of the woman rather than the husband. Triple divorce is a form of legally ending the marriage only by the husband, uttering, I divorce you 3 times. Here, Mahsati claims it as her right, as the husband is not satisfying her financially, emotionally, and physically. Is this what we can refer to as an example of a feminine voice? Some modern commentators take her use of lewd language and sexually explicit words as signs of her feminine transgression. I am not so sure about this claim, as obscenity, or what we might understand as obscene, was a normal part of classical Persian poetry, and poets such as Attar, Sanai, and Rumi are quite generous in their use of sexual imagery. Unfortunately, we do not have enough evidence of other women poets contemporary with Mahsati to make extrapolations that that was a language that was used by both genders. Another issue is that her quatrains have been mistaken for those of Khayyam, Sanai, Zahir Faryabi, and Rumi. For example, one of the butcher quatrains is also attributed to Sanai. I was personally surprised. I could not believe it when at least 3 quatrains that I was sure were Khayyams were recorded in Mahsati's diwan. And again, the problem that we have with divans of Mahsati is that many of them record poems from other female poets. And Nushatul Majalis, which is one of the most authoritative texts, it's a text that, for example, Helmut Ritter wrote on Khayyam, and Fritz Meyer wrote on Mahsati, that records 30 poems, quatrains by Khayyam and 60 by Mahsati. But from those 60, at least 16 of the quatrains have been attributed to other female poets, which raises the question, were they lumping all the female poets together, or so what was happening? And one of the poems that surprised me is that I guess all of us think it's Khayyam's, Abramad Zar var sar sabz gerist. So clouds appear and wept hard over the meadow. Life's not worth living without red wine. This meadow which is our eyes' delight today, whose eyes will take delight in looking at our dust? And you can find so many similar themes between Khayyam and Mahsati. And again, did they meet? Did they have any poetic conversation? But this idea and Khayyam's cynicism can be found in many of Mahsati's poems as well. And again, personally, I could not detect a female way of expressing it and a male way of expressing it. Again, we can talk about it more in questions and answers. In other poems, Mahsati, similar to her male counterparts, mourns the growing of beard on the beloved's face, one of the central motives in the homoerotic tradition of Persian poetry. Thus, the independence of poetic persona from the historical poet renders feminine voice impossible. We see a change of attitude amongst our male authors, from Mustafi's inclusion of her poems and the ribald exchange between her and Ahmad, to Fakhriye Hiravi's vehement rejection of the episode, to Mahmud Mirza, who does not repeat any of his predecessors in Nuql Majlis. Instead, with an exaggerated language, which is characteristic of Qajar prose, he praises Mahsati as a sweet-tongued poet. Quote, I have not seen anyone better than her in the category of women who have snatched the ball of eloquence, that is, excelled in composing poetry. He ends the short entry by lamenting the loss of the fruits of her imagination, which were trampled under the attack of Ubaydullah Khan Uzbek's army. Is the reason behind the omission Mahmud Mirza's audience? Prince Mahmud Mirza, son of Qajar monarch Fath Ali Shah, compiled this tazkere at the request of his sister, Ziya Sultaneh, in order to keep records of the efforts of the inhabitants behind the veil, as he put it. Nuql Majlis, which literally means confection of the gathering, includes short biographies of 30 women poets and selections of their poems. And the importance of the tazkere is that Mirza Mahmud is recording his contemporaries, and all of them are wives, daughters, and sisters of the king, court members. So it gives us a very, very small glimpse of what is happening in the royal women's life. And he does not name any of them. It's just their pen names, and he says, I was the only one, I was the one who gave them this pen name because of this, because of that. And it's all about how pure and pious all these women are. And only 8 women of the past are mentioned. And this is the only few biographies that includes our next poet, the ruler poet, Padshah Khatun. Is that also because her audience would empathize with another royal woman who was a ruler and a poet. And again, she is mentioned in many, many histories because she is an important figure, but not as a poet. As I said, I could not find her poems in the other tazkeras mentioned here. And another research question might be why she was excluded as a poet in the tazkeras. She is the only royal woman included among the poets in Nuql Majlis. She ruled Kerman in southern parts of Iran, hence her sobriquet, Padshah Khatun, the Lady King, as the Qaraqtai vassal of the Mongols. According to Nasruddin Munshi Kermani, the court historian in Kerman of the Qaraqtaians, she was born Safwat ad-Dunya wad-Din, the youngest daughter of Qutbuddin Muhammad and Tarkan or Turkan Khatun, who herself was a very mighty sovereign in Shiraz, and was provided with an excellent education. Some sources, and again, we don't know if it is real or not, say that actually she was treated as a boy. Her mother made her wear men's clothes. And again, I found it only in one dubious source. So again, I cannot say more on that. She came to power in Kerman through a complicated game of politics, of the Elahé. It has sisters involved, son-in-laws involved, so I'm not going to go through that. But she's characterized as a benevolent sovereign who brought justice and prosperity for her subjects during her short reign, from 1292 to 1295. She had her name inscribed on minted coins and had her name read in the Friday prayer sermons, an act reserved for the legitimate ruler of the Muslim community. She was dethroned when the Mongols took control of the city in March 1295 and was strangled shortly afterwards. She was a patron of the arts and charitable institutions and supported many scholars and poets. She wrote poetry under the pen name Elahé Khatun or Hassan Shah, and it was believed that her divan contained more than 5,000 lines, but it is lost to us. Mahmud Mirza portrays her as a competent politician under whose reign, quote, Kerman prospered financially, no oppressor chased the oppressed, and equilibrium was such that even wine did not shiver in the cup. She was kind with her subordinates and smooth-tongued with her subjects. On her poetic skills, Mahmud Mirza states, in the path of eloquence and articulateness, she has firm mastery over composing poetry, even surpassing most men. Again, bringing us to the ultimate compliment that the male authors could give to female poets, that she surpasses men. But, he continues, due to the treachery of the turning time, the distributor of justice in heavens, the author of destiny, removed her poems from the pages of the world. And yes, this Noghla Majlis is something Mahmud Mirza, and according to some, he uses all the words in a wrong way. So it's a funny text to read, but it is filled with these, the distributor of justice in heavens, the author of destiny. Her poems, too, make use of the stock imagery and familiar metaphors of Persian poetry, making any judgment about the personal life of the poet based on their poems impossible. For example, such goes one of her recorded poems. Has there ever been trace of musk in ruby, or of black galiye in clear noosh? Both are drinks. Yes, my life, that black mole on your lips is both the death of me and my water of life. Or another, which has a more cheerful tone, oh, tall cypress, I might have renounced drinking wine, but I don't remember you renouncing to serve me. In these poems, the beloved is imagined as having a black mole or being like a tall cypress, a cupbearer, all of which are characteristics of the male object of desire of the male poets. The only preserved poem in which, and this is the one that I could find, she consciously addresses her gender, juxtaposes her position as a sovereign with her text rather than her words. I am that woman, and this is the poem here, I am that woman who personifies virtue. My merna, it's a type of covering for women. My merna covers so many sovereigns. Behind the veil of chastity where I dwell, even the morning breeze hardly passes through. I keep the beauty of my shadow even from the sun because it's a wanderer. Not anyone who wears the merna shall be called a woman. Not every head who wears a crown deserves the name king. Such plays with outward femininity and inward manliness illustrates the understanding that manliness does not necessarily belong to male gender. And this brings Attar's explanation for including a woman, Rabia, as one of the friends of God in her Tazkiratul Awliya, which is the biographies of 72 friends of God. If anyone asks why Rabia al-Adawiya's memorial is placed among the ranks of men, We reply that the chief of the prophets declares, God does not regard your forms. It is not a matter of form, but of right intention. If it is right to derive 2/3 of religion from Aisha Siddiqa, God be pleased with her, then it is also right to derive benefit from one of his maid servants. When a woman is a man on the path of the Lord Most High, she cannot be called a woman. And again, this phallocentrism that keeps elevating accomplished women to the status of men. So again, we witness the trope that these women are so accomplished that their womanhood, femininity, can be ignored. Our next poet was not judged so by her contemporaries, and this brings me to Jahan Malek Khatun. My first encounter with Jahan Malek, I must confess, was not in the most dignified ways. So I wanted to teach something on Obaid, and I was looking at his biography in Tazkirat al-Shu'ara by Dawlat Shah Samarkandi, and that's where Dawlat Shah talks about Jahan Malek, calling her, quote, the witty, talented beauty of her time, who was in poetic rivalry and contestation with Obaid, who said the following about her. If one day Jahan's ghazals find their way to India, ghosts of their poets would say, what a load of shit. Also, when Khaja Aminuddin, a minister of Shah Abu Ishaq, decided to marry her, Obaid sent these lines to him. O minister, the world, Jahan, so Jahan, her name means world, and it was her pen name as well, and both Obaid and she herself plays with it. Hafez also, there is this theory that Hafez and Jahan, and I think Sepanlu is the one who's pushing the idea, but we cannot find any historical accuracy behind it, that whenever Hafez says Jahan, he is actually talking about Jahan Malek, and he was in love with her, so on and so forth. So here goes Obaid's poem. O minister, the world or Jahan is a faithless whore. Aren't you ashamed of such a whore? If you seek loose cunt, seek another. By world's lord, Jahan's not tight. And here the satirist of Zlakan is playing with Jahan's name and pen name, and the long-established metaphor of the world as a whorish, unfaithful bride. And also the same lines have been attributed to Salman Sabuji as well, so we might guess that such attitudes had gained currency in Shiraz, that these lines were attributed to different poets. Curious to find out more about her, I looked at Fakhri Heravi's Jawahir al-Ajaib. In his account, Jahan held literary salons in Shiraz, but her rivalry with Obaid is again at the center of the narrative, the cause of which is said to be Jahan's outwitting Obaid in one of these gatherings. Interestingly enough, Jahan's account continues in the next entry on Bibi Hayat, described as Arife Ruzegar, the mystic of her time, by Fakhri Heravi. She was Khaja Qawamuddin's first wife who censured her husband for marrying Jahan. And again, the names become very, very confusing. And here in the lines that I'm going to read to you, Bibi Hayat, Hayat means life. So she plays both with her pen name and that of Jahan's. Whomever concerns himself with the world, Jahan, has deprived himself of life, Hayat. Free yourself of the world and drink from the water of life. The account continues with a mention of Jahan's poetic dialogue with Hafiz. We cannot know for sure who started the conversations and who is welcoming whom, as in writing the step balls to each other. But there are at least 20 poems in the divans of the two poets that closely overlap, and Dominic Brookshaw has done research on that. More generally, her poems share a great deal of imagery and trope with her contemporaries, Hafiz and Khaju, making it difficult to discern a feminine voice in her poems, but the preface to her divan is another matter. Speech and discourse are at the center of this introduction. The exalted creator is praiseworthy for bestowing upon human beings, quote, the honor of language, eloquence, and speech, and painting their hearts with images of thought. God is the alchemist who turned a strip of flesh into the key to the treasury of secrets by the power of speech. He made the infant Jesus speak in the crib and gave salvation in this world and the next in the speech of an illiterate, that is, Muhammad. And then she goes on to explain why she compiled her divan. It is not a secret to the possessors of intellect and skill that all the people of intellect aspire to leave a sign of their existence in the world. As time gradually leaves the dust of oblivion on everything and erases faces from minds, it is inevitable to leave a souvenir that immortalizes the name after the mortal body is perished. Anyone who possesses intellect knows that it is speech whose foundations can survive tempests of time. But there was another reason for writing poetry. Time and again, she says, like the distressed state of lovers and the afflicted minds of the seekers and the broken hearts of the seers, thoughts and images of the real appeared to me, which I wrote down in the cloak of metaphors. If we allow the moment of intentional fallacy, Jahan herself is maintaining that she's trying to express the ineffable truth in the guise of metaphors. The purpose of speech, she writes, is not the external meaning, but the comprehension of secrets and mysteries. Subtle expression of metaphors is the vehicle to point towards the truths of being. She supports her argument by the Arabic expression, metaphor is the bridge to the real. And again, we don't have time, but the part on Jahan is mainly, many scholars say that we cannot find a mystical element in her. And I'm asking the question that if she's using the same stock imagery that Hafez and Khaju are using, why are we reading them as mystical, but not Jahan as mystical? Is it because she's a woman? Is it because Obaid has left such a bitter taste in everybody's mouth that we cannot think of Jahan as a mystical figure? Or there is something else? And another thing that I do not have time to talk about, but I'll just mention, is that this justification for writing poetry is very, very close to what Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi has to say about poetic truth. So basically, poetry is that thing that has access to truth. And so if the world is the metaphysical realm, the physical realm, and the imaginal realm, and we have different languages to access the truth of these different worlds, this type of talking about how metaphor is a bridge to the truth or the real really has a philosophical history behind it. After the justification of the strength and importance of her poems, content-wise, again, that's another thing. She's saying I'm talking about something real, I'm talking about something important. There's my ineffable feelings that are coming in the dress of poetry. Jahan turns to the issue of precedence in female authorship. Despite believing that composing poems is a virtuous activity done by men of science and religion, because she had not seen poems by women, she thought that people of her gender were not allowed to try their hands at the pen, or that, quote, this practice might have been considered a defect in women. She was disabused of the perception when she came upon a line by Fatima, the Prophet's daughter. The poem she's alluding to goes, it's in Arabic, indeed, women are flowers created for you. May you smell the scent of all their petals. She then refers to other Persian and Arab women who were, quote, travelers of the way of religion and birds of the path of certainty, yet they have written poetry. So there is this awareness about religion, knowledge, intellect, and writing poetry for women might be something contradictory. She ends the preface by imploring the people of wisdom and intellect to express their opinions and criticism so that, quote, this weak woman, Zaifeh, can improve her poems. I probably should have started my talk like that. I'll do it now. I ask the possessors of intellect to judge this Zaifeh and help her in understanding her arguments. A few points can be surmised from this brief preface. Speech for Jahan is a defined gift which has several registered in different types of expressions. She defends poetry as the expression of truth and metaphor as the vehicle for approximating the real. Having defended poetry and metaphorical speech, she justifies the practice by appealing to the canon, yet she's painfully aware of the absence of women in this canon. Therefore, she seeks to create the feminine canon by taking its lineage back to the prophet's daughter and other respected female characters, such as Aisha Mughriye, Padshah Khatun, Shah Khatun, another ruler poet. And interestingly enough, poets like Mahsati or Rabi ibn the Kab are absent from her list, which attests to either their disappearance by then and erasure from the canon, or Jahan's conscious choice not to include the less religiously inclined poets as her predecessors. Now, in lieu of a conclusion, in the title of my talk, I ask if feminine voices in pre-modern Persian poetry are visible, impossible, or immaterial. And let me try to imagine an answer. I don't think they are invisible. The invisibility of female voices has always been an issue, and one of the main goals of modern feminist literary criticism has been recovering and restoring these hidden figures and making them visible. In this understanding, women poets have been silenced by the phallocentric traditions, and a feminist reading would give their voice back to them. This attitude might fall into essentialism. If a female is the author, then her text is feminine. The impossibility might rise from both the specificities of Persian poetic tradition and the attempt to go beyond essentialism. The only way to be included in the canon was to insert yourself within the tradition as someone who could exactly imitate the masters of the past. The poets played with a limited stock of imagery and metaphors, and sometimes they might add new signifieds to the signifying metaphor. Then this renders distinguishing a feminine or masculine voice almost impossible, unless we make other claims. For example, the voice was always already masculine, and women did not get a chance to voice the feminine. We as modern readers should unread patriarchy from their work. Or we could follow French post-structuralist feminism. For example, in Kristeva's model, poetic language draws on semiotic language against the symbolic rule of the father. And therefore, the poetry or poetic prose of male authors such as Joyce or Mallarmé in Kristeva becomes semiotic for her. Can we make that claim for male authors of Ghazal and Rubai, that Khayyam, Rumi, Hafiz actually have a feminine voice because they are accessing that semiotic language? Is the masculinity and femininity a function of a genre? Shall we think of lyrical poetry as feminine and epic as masculine? Which again brings me back to the question of, did a woman poet produce poetry from a different subjectivity? And if so, why do I have so much trouble finding it? And finally, immateriality rises from going beyond the gender binaries and appreciate poetry as it is independent from the socially constructed contingencies of history. This attitude concerns the audience of pre-modern Persian poetry, who is not really divided along gender lines. The most recent example is Nilufar Hari's Say What Your Longing Heart Desires, in which the author showcases the influence of poetry by both men and women, but especially male mystical poets, on the religiosity of Iranian women in the 21st century. And another reason for this, for all these talks, are my American students. Should I follow my Gen Z students who protest an exercise to guess the gender of two authors based on their poems? And I have the two poems here. And for those of you who know the poems well, and again, yes, I'm somewhat tricking my students. I teach a course on love in Persian literature and all the gender dynamics that are in there. And near the end of the term, I give them these two poems and ask them to tell me what they think is the gender of each poet. And 99% of the time, they're wrong. So, and these are, again, students who are pushing me on why do I look for feminine voice in Persian poetry. With that, thank you so much. Should I stop sharing, or you want to guess the gender of the poets?